Hi everyone, and welcome to my guide for the Barrage Death Trap Rogue. This is a new version of the Death Trap Rogue that I've been playing lately. I'm almost level 90 here with my hardcore rogue, and I have been having a blast. Even with me playing on hardcore and including some extra defensive choices, I just evaporate entire screens with this, and you have really fast movement, you're borderline invincible, and you can attack at range if you want. Bosses melt in like 3 seconds. It just feels great. I intend to bring this build to level 100, which is probably happening quite soon unless I rip somewhere on the way. But for the most part, yeah, it has been really smooth, lasting all the way. Even at like almost level 90 or so, I'm farming a level up in less than 1.5 hours or so on average. So I made this default planner setup here and I just updated it one more time. We have those 3 different variants here. One where you start out at around level 50 or so, maybe earlier depending on what you want. But this is mostly based on codex powers. You can actually see that you can fill up basically the entire character with just codex powers that are actually useful for this build. Then we have the endgame variant, and then we have the endgame variant with penitent griefs, where you adjust a few points. Now, one thing to note here is that you really want to try to get an umbral ring with the 3 or 4 roll or so. So gamble those rings until you get this thing. This is kind of like the enabler for playing this build without a basic skill. So you see here there's no basic skill on the bar. I do have one here, the Invigorating Strike for the early progression. This is just a really helpful tool to give you extra resources, but later on you can actually just drop that, have the Umbral, and that will cover all of your resource issues for the most part. I do have a leveling guide for Barrage on Maxroll already that kind of leads you to this setup here, plus minus a little bit, so you can go check that out for the early levels if you want to start at level 1. But in these planners here, you can see the skill tree, you have the Paragons here, so everything is laid out, and of course the items with the aspects, they're all here. The setups don't change all too much between the different steps, but as I mentioned, especially the resource management is like the biggest part of this build, because it doesn't have a basic skill. You are just kind of like a headless chicken when you are out of resources, so you have to make sure that this doesn't happen. And with my endgame setup here right now, I have no troubles at all. I don't even look at my resources anymore, and I never run out of resources. So it feels very smooth once you have a good setup. If you have played the Death Trap Twisting Blades variant already, maybe that one from Maxroll, then you are probably familiar with a lot of these concepts here. So we have our Poison Trap, we have our Death Trap, and we have the Exposure passive. So this is kind of the main combo here. The Exposure passive allows you to reset your Poison and Death Trap together. So you have sometimes just like a second or 2 cooldown even on your ultimate ability. Now with such a fast ultimate cooldown, it begs the question, do you not want to run Preparation? And yeah, you can do that. Preparation is pretty good. I've actually tried it and it did work, but at the very least on bosses you have to swap to Inner Sight, and I didn't really like the swapping, and I just didn't feel like Preparation was that needed. Like, I'm just fast with Dash and Shadow Step together. I never really run out of like a mobility skill to use, and the only real value it has is resetting Shadow Imbuement, which is a pretty helpful tool, but also not exactly so required in this setup that you need to have it like every 3 seconds. So I just stick to Inner Sight and it feels really nice. What you need to know about the Exposure passive is that it procs a lot more when there's a lot of targets, because you produce more lucky hits and then you get these cooldown resets. If you only fight like a single target, it doesn't proc that often, but you can still reset your traps pretty quickly. And the good thing is that with Poison Trap, you just need to get like 1 single poison tick on them, and it will take for like 9 seconds, and they will be counted as affected by trap skills, so that you get this exposure procs. So even on the boss, you just go there, you throw down a Poison Trap, even if they run out of it, you can still shoot at them and you get those resets. But for the most part, this is an AoE tool. Barrage's weakness is generally the AoE damage, because you just don't really have the ability to shoot at many targets at once. You do fire 5 arrows and then they can ricochet, so you get basically up to 10 hits. And then some of them can also spread. But for the most part, yeah, you can just kind of like shoot into a pack like this, or you shotgun into a target. So when you are really close to a target, you can just like shotgun all your arrows into the same target. So this is how you generally kill elites and bosses. And then for the big packs, you can just like, for example, activate Shadow Imbue, spray into the pack, and then once 1 or 2 of them die, the entire pack explodes usually. And for the bigger packs, so when there's elites, for example, you walk in, you can do the Death Trap, and then you just basically kill everything with that. And if they're not dead, you can still follow up with a Shadow Imbue if you want. So this is generally how you play this build. It is relatively straightforward with either staying close range for the single targets or just like spraying into a pack. and then sometimes throwing in the traps. You don't rely on Shadow Imbuement and the traps entirely. You can also just like shoot into a pack when your cooldowns are down, and it will take a bit longer, but it's still fine. And outside of those things, you just like spray Barrage everywhere and you kill everything with it. And you have dash and shadow step to move around. So these are just very helpful mobility tools. I did drop the dash here in the early setup just to get the Invigorating Strike in, so you have extra resource management there. But later on you won't need that and you can go even faster. Let's talk about the skill tree a little bit. So we have Invigorating Strike. This is what we start out with here. This is the level 50 version. Then we go on to Barrage. Barrage has the neat advantage that it makes everything vulnerable. So you have the exploit glyph from the Paragons there, which is like the #1 glyph on basically every build for the vulnerable damage. But after that, after the first hit, you can still make all enemies vulnerable all the time by just spamming Barrage into them. So this is very neat and quality of life. Then we pick up a bit of healing here with Siphoning Strikes, which is very useful. We have the Shadow Step with the stun. This build actually does rely on stun a little bit. So for example, we have this here, so you can just Shadow Step in on an elite, stun them, blast them down, because you have the retribution aspect here, for example, gives you extra damage against stunned enemies, and it's a pretty significant damage modifier. And then you also have stuns from the exposure grenades. So especially in the larger packs, when you pull them in with the Death Trap, those grenades will just, fall everywhere, stun everything, and you get the retribution modifier again. And also later with the Umbral Ring, you get these resource procs for all of these stuns, so it's very helpful. Then you pick up the Poison Trap here, just a very powerful tool, gives you the knockdown as well, gives you the chance to reset your Shadow Imbuement, it gives you stuff like Trap Mastery, it gives you the exposure procs, it gives you also from the Paragons, you get Deadly Ambush here with the extra crit damage, you get damage reduction, so it's just really, really powerful utility here from the Poison Trap. The damage of the Poison Trap doesn't really matter, so you don't invest into that. Then we have Shadow Imbuement. This is our choice here for blowing up packs easily. We actually invest into this because we want bigger explosions. As I mentioned, the main weakness is AoE, and this mostly solves it. You shoot into a pack, everything explodes. And we can also make stuff vulnerable with that. At least early on, before you have your exploit glyph online, this is a good choice here, but in the late game, you don't need this vulnerable proc from Shadow Imbuement anymore, and we switch this 1 point. We have Consuming Shadows here with 2 points. This just allows you to basically refill your entire energy when inner sight is down and you blow up a pack. So you get 20 energy per enemy you kill with shadow damage, which actually also applies to the Death Trap, which is also shadow damage. So even without Shadow Imbuement, you can get those energy resets. So you can kind of alternate between the two skills here and there. And the neat thing is that Death Trap also pulls in everything, and it also gets a 10-second cooldown reset by default, basically, because it almost always kills something. And then the cooldown is way shorter, and then it comes back really quickly with exposure. Yeah, and the rest of the skill tree is mostly just passives. So we have stuff like Haste for the movement speed, we have stuff like Innovation and Second Wind for extra energy and Lucky Hit. This build does have a few Lucky Hit mechanics. We have stuff like Debilitating Toxins for the damage reduction, and then damage passives here, Exploit, Malice, Weapon Mastery. Now take note that a few points change here as you progress through the setups. So for example, when you go to like the Endgame setup, you have an Umbral Ring, then you don't need that much resource anymore. We can start taking out like a point here from Consuming Shadows. You can maybe even think about taking out some points from Innovation. They're not really that required anymore. And as I mentioned, the mixed Shadow Imbuement. And then when you have the Penitent Greaves, those boots here, you can pick up Frigid Finesse. So you get 10% extra damage against chill targets from the boots. You get another 15% multiplier against chill targets from Frigid Finesse. So this is kind of like the final version of the setup. And the boots also give you tons of these Umbral procs. So resource management becomes even easier. You can completely drop stuff like Shadow Crash and Consuming Shadows. You can also drop points from Innovation. And this is how we free up those points here for Frigid Finesse. And then you can also pick up, for example, some more defense here with Sturdy. And of course, if you're not using Invigorating Strike in the endgame anymore, you can take out this 1 point here. You have to leave 2 points because else you can't progress on the skill tree. But this also frees up yet another one that we redistributed here. If you're wondering where you can get those boots, uniques are entirely random drops in this game, so there's no way to target farm them, at least for now. You can try Hell Tides maybe with the boots chests, but so far I've not really had success with trying to get any unique there. And for the most part, I would say just run Nightmare Dungeons. They seem to have some kind of like boosted unique drop rate. For my experience leveling almost 3 rogues to level 100 now, I found them a few times on each of them. So they do drop, they're not like extremely rare, but it may take a little while. More important is to just focus on getting a good Umbral ring so that you can get this energy restoration here. So just gamble rings all day long until you get one. Let's talk about the remaining items as well. So we have Retribution here on the amulet. It's not really required to put this on the amulet over anything else. It's kind of like you want to have Edge Masters, like your most powerful aspect on the weapon, on the two-handed weapon, because it is doubled. But on the amulet, there are actually a bunch of choices. You can also put Corruption, you can also put the Accelerating, so it's a bit like, do you want more AoE damage with your Shadow Imbue? Do you want more attack speed? But keep in mind that attack speed kind of works against you with the resources. So this is only really good if you have like insane amount of resources. You could even put the Branching Volleys. So they're all kind of good choices on the amulet in my opinion. Then we have Ravenous, so whenever you kill enemies, you get energy restoration over 4 seconds. It's very useful. And this procs all the time because everything is always vulnerable pretty much. You have the Umbral, as I mentioned. You can get this in the Codex, but it's really weak in the Codex, so I would not really suggest to try to play around it too much until you find one that has at least 2 or 3. Then we have Branching Volleys. It's also in the Codex, so this just gives you more arrows. So you hit enemies, and then the arrows ricochet, and then they have a chance to become 2, and then you have even more hits. We have the Accelerating. This is not a Codex power, so you have to use something else instead. I suggest Vengeful to get started. This is just a bit of extra crit. Then we have Edge Masters, also in the Codex. We have the Pentagon Greaves here, which are replaced with Ravagers. Gives you 2 Shadow Step charges, makes it very smooth. And you can also roll a ton of movement speed there. You can roll energy cost reduction there. Very useful. But later on, not really too required. The Independent Greaves are just very nice here. Then we have Disobedience. This is like the most OP defensive aspect in the game, so you want to have that. This stacks very easily with the Shadow Immune Explosions and especially the Poison Trap. And just in large packs you have this like fully stacked all the time. Then we have Corruption, bigger Shadow Immune Explosions, also like a bigger buff from Shadow Immune with the extra crit and with the extra non-physical damage. Then we have Umbrus. This is also a non-Codex power. If you don't have this yet, I suggest you go with the Protector, which gives you a barrier when you hit enemies, when you hit elites. So this just helps you out with a bit of extra defenses. But Umbrus is really, really great in the late game especially, because you get Dark Shroud Shadows basically all the time when you attack. And if you don't get hit too often, then sometimes you just run around with like 4 or 5 Dark Shroud stacks for free. So even without actually investing points into Dark Shroud, you can get this up to 40% damage reduction here. It just feels very nice. Makes you very tanky, especially in those boss fights or so. And lastly, you have the cheats aspect here. This gives you extra damage reduction again for the crowd-controlled enemies. Especially in the Pentagon Greaves version, this is very good because these chilled enemies are considered crowd-controlled. So all you have to do is like walk through them basically, and you get this damage reduction. In the early game, you can go with the Might. This also gives you damage reduction from using a basic skill, which from the Codex version has a very short duration, but it still helps. Or you can also just have something like Umbrus plus Protector until you have like this full setup online. In terms of stat priorities, we definitely want to have energy cost reduction on the amulet, so this is like a very high priority. Cooldown is very nice. You want to have maybe like a good passive here, Weapon Mastery, for example, Frigid Finesse later, Exploit, Malice. All of these are kind of good choices. And then movement speed is always good, but you can also have damage reduction there or something like that. Just try to avoid the damage stats on amulets, they're really weak. Then you have rings, you want crit, and then vulnerable damage. So this is kind of like the holy trinity on rings, and then you can have the 4th stat, life, or crit damage with imbued skills, or even resource generation. So there's like a bunch of good stuff here. Same with this ring. Then we have also vulnerable, crit on the weapons. So you want to have this on all of your weapons. These are like just the most OP stats. We have a lot of crit chance. Then stuff like core skill damage, damage to close. Even dexterity is okay, or even all stats is okay, but mostly in the late game, early on you want to try to avoid those stats, and mostly you can focus on these damage rolls here. Damage to distant is also somewhat acceptable, but generally this is a close range build, so keep that in mind. Exactly the same goes for the two-handed weapon here. On the boots, you can have movement speed, energy cost, and then movement speed on elite kill, at least on the high levels. This is a stat which is very nice, just smooths out the farming. You can have damage reduction while injured, or dodge chance as a last stat, as a filler or so. Then comes your big defenses. Especially your chest and your pants give you tons of defenses in this game, so don't neglect those rolls. There's damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distant, damage reduction from poisoned, there's maximum life, there's even % total armor, but you should not really need it too much with the disobedience aspect. But for the most part, GG pair of pants looks like this, and it's exactly a copy of the chest. And those things make you really, really tanky. So try to focus on these roles here. Then we have the gloves. You want barrage ranks, of course. You want crit, attack speed. And then the last set is kind of whatever. There can be a bunch of things. I put lucky hit here, but you can also have the shorter trap activation, or even lucky hit, chance to slow, for example, to activate cheats easier and these kind of things. So the last set is a bit open. And then you have the helm. You definitely want cooldown on this, shadow imbuement ranks, and life. And then the last set again can be total armor, or maybe some res, or maybe even some maximum energy. And so it's kind of up to you. Now let's also talk about the Paragon setup here real quick. It is relatively straightforward as long as you follow this path. You don't have to do like really any shenanigans of respecking or so. It just kind of like comes together really nicely. The only thing is that the combat glyph here, it has the best spot in the exploit weakness board, which is the third board. But early on, when it's only the smaller radius at level 1, you might want to put it on the starting board. Everything else is kind of like in the right place from the start, and you don't really have to worry too much. In any case, we start out here, and for the endgame variant, we put Ranger on the starting board. There's a lot of dexterity here, gives you lots of marksman skill damage, and also the damage reduction from the secondary bonus. Then we have the deadly ambush board. This is the trap board. So we put the exploit glyph here. This is like your most important glyph. Level this one up first. This is priority number 1. Combat is priority number 2. So get those to 15 first, and then all of the other glyphs. It kind of doesn't matter too much after that. But make sure that you level them all at least to 15. And we pick up a bunch of extra trap stuff here. So there's trap damage and damage reduction, and there's the faster activation time, which is really cool from spring loaded. Just makes the build a lot smoother. And the extra crit damage with deadly ambush. So this is a really powerful boost. Then we move on to exploit weakness board, where you pick up a lot of stuff. So you have the exploit weakness legendary node here. Because we do hit quite a lot, this actually stacks really fast, and you get 15% multiplicative extra damage. And we have damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, extra vulnerable damage. Just a really powerful board across the board. And we get Hunter Killer. This like also gives you more movement speed, damage to elites, just smooths out the farming. So once you're here, like level 70 or something, you have probably acquired like most of these points. And from that point on, you basically just path further and get a bit more damage and damage reduction stuff. For example, here's the Brawler, kind of nice. We put the ambush glyph here for the extra damage against trapped enemies. And then later we have the no witness board, where we just pick up the glyph again with the turf. Turf is also a pretty powerful damage glyph and gives you damage reduction as well. But you don't really care much about like any special effects anymore on these later boards. It's just more stats, more damage, more defenses. And basically here ends, so to say, the progression of how you build a character. I've also optimized the pathing a little bit to meet the stat requirements here without any items. So you see this here, the Brawler has exactly the dexterity met. The strength is also met here. A few nodes don't really get the doubled effect like the focused here, but we still pick it up anyway. And the same here on the last board. You just can't meet those requirements without heavy investment. It's not really worth going for this, so just ignore it. But between the different setups, the Paragons don't change. The only thing that changes is maybe like reassigning the glyphs to a different board, as I mentioned with the combat glyph. But that's it for the most part. And this concludes the guide. I wish you good luck with the build. I am planning to add this as a written version as well in the Death Trap guide on Maxroll, so that we have the twisting blades and the barrage version side by side. But this will probably take a few days. So for now you have this video at least. I can just say that this is a super fun build, super cool to play. I have been having a blast with this, and I think it's probably one of the best builds that the Rogue currently has. We do have another version of Barrage, so if you want to check that out, we have a dedicated Barrage guide as well on Maxroll, so both for leveling and also for the endgame, and that one works with combo points. It's written by Darkside. It's also a formidable setup. So if you don't really like this resource management with the inner sight and the death trap stuff, then you can also play that, and it's really good. Barrage is just like a really solid all-round skill in my opinion. And that's it. Hope you liked this, and I'll see you guys next time.